All right, everybody, welcome back to this week's episode of Hardpoints, the podcast about energy security and the startup economy, how they intersect to shape the world around us. As always, I'm joined by my buddy here, Neal Rickner, and each week we're here to unpack the real dynamics behind the headlines, what's changing, what it means, and why it matters to you. Thanks for being here. Neal, how you been?
Good, good. I think I was just telling you that the week has been a little more reasonably paced than usual. I think you're going 130 miles an hour. I usually am at 130 miles an hour, but this week it's like 80 miles an hour. It's still way too fast, but it feels more reasonable.
Well, that's good. It is a busy week this week, next week, kind of heading into the holidays. I was traveling. I got back late last night. Um, I'm traveling again on Monday for a totally different conference. So I have to kind of prep in a different way associated with that. And then, they're great problems to have, but the customers are calling and they say, "I need you to fix this for me." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." I mean, like it's a business opportunity. It's not like a problem with the software that we're offering. It's actually like they need to expand how much they're working with us, which twist my arm. I'm sorry that's that you guys want to do that. Not really, of course, but like it's urgent for them, so it's urgent for me. So how do we get on top of that?
Yeah, well, it's also counterintuitive, right? The sort of common narrative these days is that things are slowing down on climate action and that renewables are in trouble. But you're not seeing that?
No. No, not at all. Actually, one of the functions of climate, at least for within the reporting space, which is where we operate, which is that in a global economy, if you have a regulation anywhere, then it applies everywhere effectively.
Right.
And so,
This
at
is
least
why
derivatives.
this is why the car makers don't like California's emissions standards.
Yep, exactly. So, and these climate regulations are kind of all over the place. Like, so it's not just like you can shake your fist at California, even if like somebody would get rid of California's, like it still exists in Australia and the United States and Canada. It exists in Europe, of course. So that's becoming a thing there. And then the world keeps warming. So it's the greatest market forcing mechanism in the history of markets is climate change, and it really is not a question of if, but when this thing really explodes. And one of the cheat codes that they used to say for in Y Combinator, which we didn't attend, is if you can hook yourself into a market that's growing by 20% year over year, then you don't even have to be all that good. You just have to ride the wave. And I'd like to think we're pretty good, but we are definitely riding a wave. So it's 20% of a very small market, but 20% year over year compounds very, 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 very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, compounding works that way. Well, that's good, man. Look, opportunity, whenever it comes, you got to be ready to capitalize on it. I think my slowdown is because the financing was sort of largely wrapped up last month. I've got some cats and dogs, but this month it's been mostly just getting the pilot site built, and that's a sprint. But you order something, you got to wait a minute. You transport it, you got to wait a minute. So there's some of that going on with me too. Like the storm is brewing. It's going to come right back at me when the suppliers catch up to us. But anyway, it's at least I'll take the breather when I can get the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something too about because like in order to raise that money, you had to have the plan for implementing it to a certain extent. Then people need to look at it, and because there is that kind of lagging thing, you're just executing the plan. And so like there's turnarounds where that has to happen. And of course there's going to be delays because that's how life works. But nonetheless, like you're just implementing that plan. So, one of the things that we talked about is that for Acclimate was there's sometimes where you need to be heads down, just running as hard as you can, sprinting. And then there's other times where you can jog. It's kind of like a fartlek almost. Which is like sometimes you're just like in your pain cave. Let's get this part done, right? But then there's other times when you're like catching your breath a little bit and you're still moving forward, right? But like that's the time you start thinking about like in a fart, like you're starting to think about like how much this sucks. But but in the real world, like how can I move this company forward? And I'm kind of like I'm today in these couple of weeks, I'm kind of in that sprint mode. But generally, like we're in this period now where it's like, how can I how can I clean my thinking up so that way, while I've got this period of reflection, which is the last month or two has kind of been, uh, today notwithstanding, how can I move the company forward more there? And I was talking to an advisor this morning, and it was very. I keep coming back to this sense of identity. For a long time, I internalized acclimate just needed to survive. I was in survival mode, and now that we're moving out of survival mode and more into kind of a growth mode, like who are we as kind of a company? And I'm starting to lean a little bit more into the idea of like I want to disrupt. Like I want to actually like I'm getting a little bit more swagger about like what I'm doing. And I'm kind of getting excited about that. I don't know. Have you ever had kind of an experience like that?
Um, yeah, well, I've certainly had the "who are we" thought, and I wonder sometimes if I'm balancing as we're sprinting, and the analogy, you're building the airplane as you're flying it. That's very much startup life. I often feel like I don't have enough time to stop and think about who we are and what we're about, and really make sure we're aligned on culture, because I know how important culture is. Um, and I have this sort of inner challenge of like, culture is so important, you can't afford not to do it. But how do you take the 5 minutes or hour to actually invest the time to do it when these very real deadlines of like steel that's got to go in the ground? So that's the part I definitely relate to.
Yeah. There's that adage about was it Charlie Munger that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, the
Mm-hmm.
other adage is that if you don't define your culture, it will be defined by somebody else. Um,
Yeah.
so there's
Yeah.
kind of a
Yeah.
commander's intent sort of idea here of like, how do you,
Yeah.
I think probably the best example I ever had of that was, and we, we brutally made fun of him for it, but it was good. Um, I had a commanding officer, a guy named Monty Ashelman. I think hands down one of the best leaders I've ever known in my entire life. I keep in touch to him with him to this day. And the moment he showed up to our squadron as the XO, so in the Navy you fleet up, so you do like 15 months if I remember as XO, and then you do 15 months as commanding officer. XO is kind of the number
Mm-hmm.
two in the chain of command for those unfamiliar. And so the moment he showed up as the XO, like he commanded, right? Which I think the commanding officer that was in front of him was clearly the commanding officer, but Monty owned the room.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the very first things that he talked about is like you'd see all these squadrons that talk about how they're the world famous Golden Dragons or the world famous this, and he goes like, "What the fuck is world famous? You can be a scoundrel for being world famous. Uh, what you want to be is world class." And when he set that, he's also from Eastern Colorado, so he's a huge Denver Broncos fan, and he would talk about like John Elway nonstop. But um, when he set that, like that really did just that little bit too word identity really set
Mm-hmm.
into, I think, to the minds of all the junior officers and enlisted, men and women that were operating within the squadron about like how you want to be operating as a squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember we had this one, like, I want to say it was like 4 weeks, 3, 4 weeks, where we were at sea in between port calls, and it was just like a work day every day.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't miss a single sortie for 3 weeks in carrier
Mm.
operations, which is fairly high paced.
Yeah, that's
We didn't
pretty
miss
rare though,
anything.
right?
Yeah, the squadron was just cranking, man, and it just
Mm.
felt awesome. Like we almost didn't want to go into port because because
Mm-hmm.
everybody was just like in a groove.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think about like how those two worlds being words world class really kind of permeated the consciousness of the 300 people that were in that squadron to go get to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so Monty Ashelman, great American, great leader.
Nice. Awesome, man.
Well, maybe we should get to the news here a little bit. Your lane of running here. Let's talk about the U.S. Department of Energy. They've committed 134 million to rare earth recovery projects. They announced new funding to bolster domestic recovery of rare earth metals from discarded electronics and other sources, effectively mining landfills and the recycling streams. The move is meant to reduce dependence on foreign supply chains and strengthen the U.S. critical material security, which is, of course, not only viewed but is accurately part of the broader national security strategy. You have any thoughts about that, Neal?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty nice correction, actually. I don't know that I agree with every parcel of the approach here, but I definitely am behind the idea that we need have our own production here. It's not just, I mean, we've got the rare earths. What we lack is the ability to process and produce actual useful output from the mining operations. Um, but there's a couple things to say here. One, we got out of this business in a short-sighted way because nobody was sort of helming the ship, which is to say this is a national defense critical vulnerability, and capitalism, the free markets sort of, and some environmentalism pushed this out of the US. So the free market part of it is just, it was more economic to have China do it. And the environmental sustainability part of it is that we did have this capability in California, but the mine got, or California or Nevada, but it got shut down by environmental concerns. And I think those two things together were like, nobody was paying attention and just let it go. So look, we need to make stuff. We make stuff with rare earths. So you can't be relying on China.
Yeah, it's not just, I mean, all that rare earths. Like copper, for example, is not known as a rare earth element. We're not talking, you know, what is it, palladium or some of those, more specialized minerals. Like there's just not enough copper on the planet for what we need to be doing from a climate perspective, or at least copper on the planet in the supply chain for what we need to be doing. And so, like, where are we going to get this stuff? One of my friends is a guy named Tim Tummerbat. He runs
Oh yeah,
you've crossed Tim's path.
Yep.
Yeah, so Tim runs a small venture capital fund, him and a gal named Botchmeg. And they run it's Nomadic Venture Partners. And it's focused exclusively on acquiring or investing in companies that are solving this problem. So one of my favorites there is a gal named Liz Dennett, she's just kind of one of those people, like if she was an asshole, like you'd love to hate her, but she's such a nice person that you're just like in her corner.
Yeah.
Because she's fucking good at everything she does. She has a PhD in astrobiology, which I didn't even know was a field.
Is that asteroids?
No, it's like searching for extraterrestrial life by using the signals of biology that you can detect through like spectroscopy.
Oh my gosh, so many big words. Okay,
yeah, exactly. So like just being able to describe what she does requires like practically a PhD. So she did that for a while, and then she went on. She was like pretty senior like database person at AWS, Amazon Web Services, for those that are not in kind of the startup space. And then she started a company called Endolith. They just finished raising a Series A, and Endolith they use microbes for mining. So they go to like all these mine tailings. There's a lot of like, as you've gone mining, you grind through the material or whatever, and then you just end up having like a pile of dirt a lot of times that you can't really use much. And it still tends to be pretty rich in minerals, but it's just hard to extract without, using the traditional technologies. So Endolith is doing that with microbes. And so rare earths are kind of having their moment. Like minerals broadly, rare earths, specifically, like they're having their moment where there's kind of like this component of the intersection of national security and climate, which is kind of like our land, man. Like we care about national security, we care about climate. And so it's interesting to see this kind of moving from a climate lens in the Biden administration to more of a national security lens in the Trump administration. But either way, moving, which is cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd also like to sort of push on this environmental / just sustainability piece. I mean, as I've gone out to develop wind projects, for example, one of the biggest roadblocks is the sort of sustainability folks that don't want projects built for environmental reasons. And it's sort of this one. I don't know if you know too much about the project that was, I think it was California, but it might have been California, Nevada anyway. And how that got essentially shut down by environmental concerns. Do you know that story?
No, could you explain it to me?
Now, I don't know it well enough, but anyway, I guess the broader point here is, Bill Maher likes to complain about how it took him 6 years to get solar built on his property. And, Ezra Klein talks about, abundance and getting regulations out of the way so that we can actually do big projects. So it's sort of tied to something I know you talked about, which is building big stuff, doing ambitious work. And so finding the balance between being good environmental stewards, which I know we all want to be, um, and building stuff,
Yeah, there's kind of a
or
component
in this case, mining stuff.
mining stuff. Yeah, there's kind of a forest for the trees kind of problem here. Sometimes where we're so focused on the small details that we're missing kind of the big picture, right? But there's also like I think a lot of scar tissue here. I used to see this in my Renew West days when I was like working on forestry projects, right? A lot of animosity between forest landowners that were using this for timber and the environmental community. And so like when I would show up and they were like, "Wait, you want to talk about climate? You're an environmentalist." Oh, I don't know. Like, and so you'd have to kind of like get over this hump of like, no, 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 I'm a little bit different. But by the way, you are too, right? So let's like just put those old fights to bed. And so some of those old fights, in my experience, were sometimes there was large companies. In the case of the mill town where my grandparents lived when I was a kid, they shut down the mill and it killed that town. Um, and they blamed it on the environmentalist. And the reality is that they had just outstripped their timber supply and they didn't want to retool, and so they found a convenient scapegoat. So sometimes that happens. You'll see this also sometimes where people will blame, we're doing this for the environment, but it's really they just don't want to block their view. Like this is like what Trump and his wind turbines thing, right? Is like he just doesn't want to look at wind turbines when he's golfing in Scotland or whatever, right? So there's some of that, but let's be fair. There are also sometimes kind of some of those old school environmentalists that just can't get the fuck out of their own way. And we need to figure that out. On the flip of it, there are definitely like, it used to frustrate me because like California has this funding source associated with kind of with their carbon market. The carbon market as they auction off allowances, generates a lot of revenue that the state then uses for greenhouse gas reductions, and a lot of that money went into high speed rail in California, and it didn't do well, right? And so like there's this component of like you have to clean out the regulations, but then like the people that are like ostensibly like for regulatory reform are cheering the fact that California isn't doing this which to me is anti-American, right? Like, no, you should be like not cheering that California can't do this. You should be mad that we are failing as a country to be able to do this. And at least in this particular case, California was attempting to dream big. Now same thing. They kind of need to get out of their own way. But I think that's part of what's going to happen, with the mining component of it. I'm not convinced that the Trump administration is going to navigate that well. But a matter of fact, I'm quite convinced they're not, just based on the fact that like they tend to be a bull in a china shop and they're just a kind of a caged animal that flails about and breaks shit mostly, rather than like an oxen that you've attached a yoke to and is really pulling a heavy load, right? But I wish them success on this particular one. I'm also skeptical of them doing this in a way that isn't really just kind of lining their pockets or lining their buddies' pockets, as we've kind of seen with this, all the above energy strategy that really actually somehow doesn't mean all the above. It's really just pro fossil fuels and not, about the cheapest, most reliable energy source that we have. So I don't know. I'm hopeful but skeptical.
Yeah. Well, and that ties into another story we kind of teed up here, which is around the AI infrastructure operations, or AI in infrastructure operations. And I think, part of where my mind goes is, as we're already fucking up the build big projects and already not really getting that right, we're at the same time layering on AI because it's going to make things better and cheaper and more safe. And while we're doing that, opening up a bunch of vulnerabilities with a tech that the administrators who are bringing this on don't really understand. And so there's new guidance out for the U.S. and allied governments, from the U.S. and allied governments, about how we use critical or AI and critical infrastructure. So I don't know. I worry about that too because it's such a new tech. It's so unproven. I use it every day, but for stuff that I can QA, right? Stuff that isn't. I'm not letting AI make any decisions for me yet. For example, but I know it's tempting if you're running a grid or if you're running a water treatment plant to let AI do your job for you. And um, yeah, as you do that, you leave yourself open to hackers, to uh, other other risk factors that could be both an energy and a national security concern.
Yeah, to tie the two together, actually going back to the DOE thing was, did you see the proposal from Chris Wright about how we need to be generating more electricity and what his suggestion was?
Oh, I think so. No, but remind me though.
I mean, I actually kind of I appreciate the out of the box thinking associated with it, but like it's pretty not good. Um, all the backup diesel generators that are associated with like big box stores or hospitals or things like that, there's actually a fair amount of backup capacity on the grid
Yeah.
right now that's not connected to the grid because it's really just for like a microgrid.
Right.
But the problem with that is like that's supposed to be like kind of a critical like reserve infrastructure, so that's a problem from a
Yeah.
resilience component. And then also,
Yeah.
by the way, that stuff's dirty, right? Like you're
Oh
talking
yeah.
about like breathing a lot of gross air just so AI can continue to expand kind of unabated. Um, going back to this though, is I kind of view this like being like an autopilot, like AI being like autopilot in an airplane. We still have
Mm,
humans at the controls, and we haven't given up on the idea of putting two pilots, even let alone just one pilot in
hmm
into commercial airliners. And I have to admit it, flying on a commercial airliner last night, I was glad there was two pilots up there. And
Yep.
but the experience of being an airline pilot is putting your hands on the controls very, very little anymore. Like,
hmm
I mean, like they don't really do it much for takeoff. They don't do it much for landing. And it's to the point now, like it's noticeable to me, like when they put their hands on the controls because the rest of the experience is so,
Yeah. Yeah.
dampened and smoothed by like that. It's almost certainly a machine involved, right?
Yeah. I always know when I have a Navy pilot up there.
Yeah. That's because it's excellent. Anyways, but but there is, within the airline pilots, they talk about like, this perishing skill, right? Which is if you
Yeah.
just don't put your hands on the controls, do you really know how to fly airplanes anymore? Or are you just really a system
Mm,
operator?
hmm
Um, I
Yeah,
mean,
I'm okay with that though. Like I want system. I think I've said this to you before. Like I don't need the pilot to be doing the monkey skills. I want him up there when things go wrong. Like where's my nearest divert? What are my options? Make a good like holistic decision about where to go, what to do with the airplane when the shit hits the fan. Like Sully Sullenberger landing in the river saved a bunch of lives only because he had 40 years of experience and he didn't try to go back to the field. He made a good decision to just do a water landing. Like an I don't know. Would an AI have done that? I doubt it.
maybe, or where they've reacted more quickly and been able to get it back to the field.
I'm skeptical.
I am too, like, but that's the devil's advocate kind of argument here is that like
Yeah.
because if you watch the movie, which is a dramatization and not actually fully based in the
Yeah.
reality of the event, but like the movie solely, like the whole thing is like how quickly did he react to the problem and then make an appropriate correction.
hmm
And could an
Yeah.
AI have done that?
hmm
Maybe, probably not. Um,
Yeah.
but but the flip of that is like to argue why like standard procedures for airline pilots and a lot of these automations that are in that have made air travel way, way safer in our lifetime. And so
Oh
there is
yeah.
some proof in the pudding here about like, let's not be
Yeah.
kind of categorical. It's either going to be all human or all machine or something, like
Mm-mm.
what's the right way to kind of integrate all this stuff at the same time
Yeah.
that you're not burning the fucking planet down because you want to like have a goofy video about, Trump riding a Tyrannosaurus or something, like,
Yeah. Y- Yeah. I mean, if I can use an analogy here, what I'm what I'm doing with my emails is primarily like the AI writes the email and I edit it and send it. But it's helping me, but it's not deciding for me. And I think that's, you know, I just know that if you're a water district supervisor, water districts are notoriously underfunded. They are, uh, they have a routine set of decisions they have to make. I know that if you're that operator, you're tempted to just say, let the AI do it. I can eliminate one more staff. My margin goes from like zero point zero 0.01 to zero point zero 0.05. And I live to survive another day. At the same time, this is what I mean by like vulnerabilities. If you do that, then what have you opened yourself up to? And I think the answer is like nobody knows. We have a whole evolution here of technology development by which we're going to go through a bunch of failures in order to institute the right balance. That's going to take some time. Um,
Yeah.
I think
AI, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is AI tends to work pretty well when there's a known boundary set, like when there's known rules to
Mhm.
a game, right? So early
Yeah,
AI
makes
was like, Deep Blue and, beating Kasparov in chess. And then they moved on to Go, which is a more, fluid game, but there's still like rules to the game associated with that.
hmm
And, we're well past Deep Blue now, right? Like AI is,
hmm
answering your emails, for example, right? But
hmm
so I kind of wonder about like in these critical infrastructure sort of components is like there's the defensive of like what is the vulnerabilities of the AI that are involved in the system for being able to be hacked by outsiders. But I also wonder if there's the
mm
offensive component or the security, the security layer around it, like which is can the AI be used to to counter the opponent, just like they did in Deep Blue or in Go, right? How open
mm
is that? Are the rules of that game from an AI
mm
perspective? And I don't really know that, so I'd be curious to kind of learn about what that is there. Um, Generally, when you have complexity, you add in opportunities for infiltration, and
That's
you lose the capacity for humans to kind of oversee it.
that's
So
what that you just nailed what my concern is. I think we're seeing the number of cyber attacks is only increasing. Then because the number of vulnerabilities are increasing because of what you just said.
yeah, but is there like humans are also incredibly fallible, right? Which is like when we talk about the autopilot sort of thing. Is are things
hmm
where through
Yeah.
procedures that you can actually remove complexity by having specific computer systems and then defend around that? I don't know. We definitely have to
Mm-hmm.
talk to somebody that knows more about that than I do. But I do worry about the degree of infiltration. Like it's even beyond just like the AI of like what's this district manager doing. It's the long concern has always been about like what's the firmware running the pump.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
What's the protocol or the software that's running the transmission regulation for electricity. I went through targeting school prior to my doing my cruise missile gig out in Sixth Fleet, and one of the things that we talked about is like critical nodes. How can you bring them down? And there was ways to do it with weapons effects, but there's ways that you can do it otherwise. Um, and sometimes you don't want to drop it that the whole time. You only want to drop it a little bit, or it's a delay of service or denial of service kind of attack. Or so um, one of the things that I think we've learned in industrialization and in globalization is that um, and through the pandemic is that we really optimized for efficiency for a very long time. And when you optimize for efficiency, you have to. There's a lot of pieces in that machine that have to be well maintained. And if one of those falls apart, then you lack the ability to kind of keep it going. And so supply chains fell apart because they weren't resilient enough. They were highly efficient, but not very resilient. And so, like, it's the same sort of thing here. Like, are we optimizing for efficiency in the case of that AI replacing a water engineer, and making the system less resilient?
Mm. Well, we shall see. Another headline that caught my attention is that the new I mean, again, this goes something I said to you about your business, which is the headline seems to be renewables are getting crushed. And like, look, the big, beautiful bill, big, ugly bill is not good for renewables for sure, but also,
The bub.
but look, at 67% of new capacity headed into through 2028 now is still projected to be solar, which is pretty incredible when you consider they're working on opening coal plants, gas turbines are being bought and installed. There's geothermal, there's nuclear. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing that 67%. That's a higher number than I would have predicted.
Yeah, you're like the IEA. I'm just joking.
Yeah, touche.
Yeah, no, 2/3 of new capacity. That's in a rapidly growing demand space for electricity, and both through electrification of homes and cars, but more importantly through the kind of the component of AI, like the fact that like we're adding 2/3 of new capacity over the next 3 years is going to be from one renewable source, not even solar and wind, just one.
Just one. Yeah.
It's pretty incredible. I think it's a good. I mean, like I worry about we're kind of locking in China's leadership position because we aren't like we're the one thing that we're not working to do is to onshore effectively the capacity to manufacture any of this.
Well, we were, but we're not anymore.
Yeah, that was part of the IRA, but they undercut that because reasons. So yeah. But yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of in my Renew West days when I'd go out and I'd tour all these different properties looking for areas to do reforestation. And there was the American West, there's kind of three landowner types mainly. You have the federal government, you have individuals, typically owning like somewhere between 5 and 50 acres. And then you have the wealthy, who own like, maybe 10 to 100,000 acres or more. And there was always kind of like this balance between, as a public lands owner, like I wanted the federal government to own and manage this land because I wanted access for the people. I feel, very strongly from kind of a democratic reason. But also that we had kind of underfunded like some of the land maintenance issues associated with that because we were focusing more on either resource extraction or something. And so they hadn't done any of the thinning activities that they needed to do to prevent wildfire. On the flip of it, when you'd work with those small landowners, they just didn't have the resources in order to be able to do it. And so you find this place where you're almost rooting for the rich guy in conservation a little bit because like it was the best of the three options because, a lot of these guys, they created effectively, little private game reserves. I went to this family who I won't name. They owned a several mile stretch of the Continental Divide, a whole valley leading up to it. And it was like an American Serengeti. There were elk running around all over the place.
Oh, that's cool.
So much wildlife. And I was just like, man, this should be a national park. But
I strive for that. I want to be a rich guy and buy a big plot of land and have elk on my land. That sounds
okay.
Great.
Well, I have the place in mind for you. If you get like if you get fuck you money that wants to buy it off of an old money that doesn't really use it all that often. So it's kind of a nature.
All right. Yeah.
Anyways,
Here's sorry. Go ahead.
Solar
finish.
Component.
Yes.
Back to the solar component. What I was going to say is that like, I'm not rooting for China to win on this, but like of all the options, like I'd rather, in this particular example, I'd rather China win because we are choosing to lose. And like, we need climate to win.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I don't know. I don't know if I can say I want China to win. That
maybe
phrase
that's
I
too
can't
strong.
say. I can't say and feel good about. But I mean, I think that there have been a few things that have just been solved, right? VHS and Betamax, it happened. It's over. Like there's not much we can do about it. I think solar is one of those things that just it happened. There's not a way for us to catch up at this point. Batteries, we had our chance just like in the last 5-10 years, and I think there's some element of that still remains as an opportunity. But anyway, to your point about, I want to go back and talk about the land because I had this like this dream when I was coming up where I wanted to have a plot of land where the only way in or out was with an airstrip. I had to fly in or horseback, but like no roads into my ranch. And now I've got elk on the ranch too. Thanks to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think you're dreaming small.
Oh, okay.
Ted Turner, one time, he was, I think at the time, he may still be the largest single landowner in the United States. And he said that he wanted to be able to ride a horse from Mexico to Canada on his land.
Oh,
So, like, I
yeah.
think you need to kind of up
Wow.
your game, Neal. You need to go like Ted
Okay.
Turner, as far as like owning,
Oh my
a
gosh.
demonstrable chunk of America.
Okay. So this is a weird transition, but I'm going to do it anyway. So that was energy. We're moving on to national security now. We were just cheering for a rich guy. You were just saying you want the rich guy
I
to
don't
have
cheer
the
for
land.
rich guys. I'm definitely not cheering for China, right? But I do cheer for like us leaving a planet that's habitable and has like nature in
Yes.
it, right? And so like
Uh,
that's unfortunately because everybody else is choosing to root against that in ways that are destructive. You have to kind of end up rooting for the villain.
uh, well, let's root for another rich guy, Palmer Luckey, who founded Anduril. And so, like, the story here is that Anduril's basically failed a couple of tests. One of their drones has been especially sort of troubled in the recent past, where they were doing a couple of test flights over Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and I don't know the details here, but basically, like a couple of them, more or less, just fell out of the sky. And as somebody who's been in the aviation world for I don't know what 25 years now, I find this pattern sort of comical. Every time there's a new airplane and it fails when it's early, as the F-14 did. And this is the beginning of like time for me in aviation as I started following all this stuff. Like there were calls that the F-14 program was going to just never make it. And then it made it. And then the F-16 had a bunch of early failures. And then the F-18 had a bunch of early failures and on and on. Most recently in our lifetime, like the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, there are calls from Congress to cancel it because it's over, budget overruns and it's just never going to work and it doesn't have the great combat capability, et cetera. And so to me, I'm interested in your opinion, but to me, this is a chance to take a shot at Anduril, who's been a market leader and has raised a bunch of money. And we don't know all the details of the technical program, but it's not surprising to me that an early prototype is failing, is falling out of the sky.
I tend to think of it from like this question of evolution versus revolution, right? Which is like if you're developing something brand new and it's pretty amazing, you should plan for failure, right? Matter of fact, you're not pushing fast enough if you aren't. And so like when the people are like kind of rooting against like Elon's a jackass, but like when
Brilliant
rockets
jackass, but
but
yeah.
when rockets blow up, like as part of like the testing process and development, great. Like
Yeah.
I'm not great, but like that means you're probably pushing fast, right? And there comes a question if like they're all blowing up, maybe you're pushing a little too fast, you know. There's definitely like I think back to like my the tilt rotor aircraft, the Osprey, that's takes off like a helicopter, flies like an airplane, and then lands like a helicopter. And this applies to you in the Marine Corps, which is killed a few Marines, and that matters. Those lives mattered. And so there probably wasn't the right amount of risk controls associated with that. Like it's okay if you have like test pilots. It's a different thing if you have grunts that are, like the test pilots signed up for it. The grunts are just grunts. Like we shouldn't be killing grunts. Their life is dangerous enough as it is. Um, so there's definitely kind of this balance of like risk reward. How fast are you pushing? What are some of the controls you have for that? And like if you're going back to kind of bigger when we were talking about California, if you're going to do a big thing, you have to be accepting a failure along the way. Right. And you want to make sure that you don't let perfect be the enemy of good, that you don't let speed get inhibited by like a unwillingness to take risks. NASA has been feeling that. And like, frankly, that's the big difference between NASA and SpaceX. NASA couldn't accept those risks. SpaceX did. As a result, SpaceX is now dominating everything going to space. Um, so that's the revolution side of things. Like it's a whole new brand thing, right? But then there's a lot of these other things that are more like a revolution or an evolution, right? Which is in uh like but the difference between the Hornet and the Super Hornet wasn't all that big of a deal, right? There was some, and like I know the Marines like had like a whole bunch of internal angst because the Marines are angsty as a service. Um, but like there just wasn't that much that was going on there because there was kind of an evolution of what was going on there. It was a spiral development. And so when you start treating certain weapon systems like a platform where you can plug in components and change it and have it evolve. And so I think about that with Anduril, which is uh, defense acquisitions needs to be shook up like real hard. It is wasteful and expensive, doesn't provide the warfighter what it really needs, and it takes way, way, way too fucking long. Um, so I'm kind of rooting for Anduril on that, right? And so like if this is kind of their first like little component into it, go after it, right? But like I wonder, is there opportunities for them to take the ego out of it and stop building their own thing necessarily? Take somebody else's thing and then evolve it. And I don't know enough about the process there, but like that's the questions I start asking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my call here is just for a little bit of like, take a breath, people. It's gonna be like, I take your point wholeheartedly. I do think that there's opportunity for them, Angel, that is, to partner. But their disruption has been to step outside the normal acquisition, the normal prime acquisitions sort of pattern, and essentially incorporate high tech into their development. And so they are probably on that leading edge in the way that you described it. Um, anyway, I just want to provide a little historical context, which is like every platform. I'm not aware of a single platform that just went from prototype through maturity without some trips,
Oh yeah.
without some stumbles along the way.
I don't know enough about like what is the end state for what they're trying to build for this Altius drone. Like, do you know what the functionality is that it's supposed to be providing?
I mean, it's basically a fighter attack kind of drone. Not fighter attack. It's an attack drone. It's a medium size, sort of like it has some more capabilities, more stealthy than a Predator, goes faster, but can deliver strikes and reconnaissance in a way that like it's sort of like an F-18 replacement in some ways without the fighter component.
Yeah, so like you do worry about like a plane that falls out of the sky, right? Like this is not like an error in a critical phase of flight. Like 8,000 feet is a lot of altitude. I mean, it's not a ton, but it's more than enough for like if you had a pilot at the controls to input some sort of corrective action and fix it if the pilot knows what they're doing. So like was there some sort of critical phase of flight that was happening here? Like, were they in a weapons delivery profile or something? Probably not, right? This is just basic, like, is the plane flying sort of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, little has been reported on it, but best we can tell, it's sort of like the way it was described is like the engine seized up and it didn't have enough energy in the airplane to get back to base. So kind of like that, or maybe like a control surface locked up and it just completely lost control. But they have not released a public statement about it. It's just been what external agencies have reported, which is probably a little dramatic too. Let's be clear. It's probably like it fell out of the sky. Maybe it didn't actually just fall straight down. And there's two of these, right? They weren't identical. So
yeah, no, there's this component of where it's there's levels of knowledge and understanding, and like you need to be really careful to like remove your ego if you think you know a lot but you actually don't. And so there's that component here for me too. Like I had a different CO, a guy named Scott Fisher, who not to divulge anything classified here by any stretch, but like the JOs were all sitting around talking about like, oh, there's this problem and why isn't anybody working on it? And I remember him looking at us and be like, this is a big country and full of a lot of smart people, and everything you've thought of, somebody else has, and they're working on it. So just shut up. I mean, he didn't say shut up, but like that it was pretty clear of like, check your ego. There's some smart people that are working on this. And So yeah, it seems a little suspect to me that like they had that failure, but like also I don't know a goddamn thing about like designing a jet engine. And so
Mm,
this is probably within the bounds of normal test, especially if it doesn't involve loss of life.
it
Like
didn't. Yeah.
then fine, push that edge.
Yeah. 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 Well, speaking of learning from others, another news story we came across this week was about Asia learning from the sort of wartime energy resilience of Ukraine. And I think this is super interesting to me. This is energy and national security sort of intersection to a T. I didn't know this. Taiwan is dependent for 95% of its energy from external sources. Japan is 90%. I knew it was high. I actually been to Japan a bunch of times and looked at this. I did not know that Japan imported 90% of its energy. And, also what came out in this article is that, Russian attacks had disabled 60% of Ukraine gas production. Um, and that's more than I expected. I mean, you hear stories all the time about how Russia is attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure. I didn't realize it was that high. So anyway, Ukraine has made some shifts. The adaptation here is that they have actually, again, sort of on point for you and I, is that they've added a ton of flexible clean power. They've added 1.5 gigawatts in wartime, and that's only counting through 2024. That's not even counting what's been installed in 2025, which I think is pretty incredible. So the lesson for Asia, at least what this article's point was, you you can learn from the Ukrainians that if you install sort of batteries, wind, and solar, you can provide a more flexible, resilient power source. And this is distributed solar, so it's harder for Russians to attack. This is on rooftops and in small plants. And then the second point was that they got essentially a reconstruction and development loan from the Euro Bank to buy emergency gas. And so the point here was, if you're Japan or Taiwan, set up those facilities before you need them, because if they do get attacked, you're going to need those facilities pretty quick. So anyway, I just thought it was a good juxtaposition of this energy sits to the crux of national security, and renewables, battery, solar, and wind is part of the solution.
Yeah, the environmental community has been talking about microgrids for a long time, because it helps to, if you generate your energy locally and they're consuming it locally, you have less line losses, you have a little bit more of a resilient grid. The
Mm-hmm.
preppers of the world have loved that for a long time because like they get
Yeah.
to, like don't have to pay money to the man, or, they can dream about the apocalypse or whatever. But so it's kind of interesting, like in the near apocalyptic scenario, which is an invasion by a major power into a small country, like that. What they ended up going to was microgrids, and so it kind of
Mm.
ties into this efficiency versus resiliency question that we were talking about earlier. It even talks a little bit about like kind of what Chris Wright's trying to do at DOE, is the idea
Mm.
of effectively he's taking like little microgrid sources and helping them to try to make the macro grid a little bit more resilient,
Mm.
to lean upon the existing resilience within the grid, I should say, in order to kind of expand capacity for that. Again, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's a great example or great use case in what Secretary Wright's trying to do, but nonetheless, I like that out of the box thinking. I do like the idea of
Mm-hmm.
microgrids, and
Mm-hmm.
as somebody that put solar power on my roof a couple of years ago, and I have two EVs, and I set it up
Mm-hmm.
so that like I charge my EVs. I'm kind of borderline prepper, because like I'm trying to like build it, or, and consume everything that I'm doing on my own. But I'm also kind of borderline environmentalist, and then like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, man. Like I just dig everything about it except for like the invasion. Um, so except for the invasion, and but yeah, build for resiliency is something that happens here, and it helps to. I'm gonna go way off fucking script here now too, because like so one of the things that's been, I promise I'll bring it back to, one of the things that's been demonized here for a while is ESG. And for those that are not familiar, is ESG is kind of a corporate buzz phrase that became very attacked, starting even well before Trump. Actually, it was like around 2018, people started really going after it. and it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And the general idea behind environmental, social, and governance is it gets attacked as being like woke capitalism or some shit like that. But like what it really is it's actually about risk analysis, and that if you have bad controls around like what you're doing in the environment, or around how you're interacting with local populations or your own personnel, or if you have bad governance procedures, you may outperform for a while until you don't. And when you don't, it's catastrophic. It tends to like, level companies. And, like, so it's the same sort of thing here is like, do you have resilience built into kind of the structures of your organization? Um, and it's all about risk controls. And so like you may have a small, cost to you kind of ongoing in the short term because you're not organizing for maximum revenue production. In the case of ESG, you're not maximizing for maximum efficiency and kind of other systems. But you are absolutely introducing a ton of risk that was going to potentially blow up in your face, and your country, your economy, like we saw in 2008. Like resilience is valuable, and in the climate perspective, like resilience is important. We are going into a warming world. We know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, a little far afield, but let me connect a couple dots here. There was an article I read this week on batteries, lead batteries, not the lithium ion batteries we talk about with
standard lead acid that like you'd put in a car effectively.
Yeah. And that lead is recycled, which sounds great. It turns out though that if you want to recycle lead, it's a messy process, right? You got to break apart the battery, you got to smelt it down, and you've got to it goes through another heat process, and then it comes out and it's back to being, a feedstock for new batteries. A ton of that recycling had been outsourced to Nigeria,
which doesn't really do the recycling at all in many ways.
Well, there were zero safety protocols adhered to in any of that process. U.S. companies were buying the feedstock without really understanding their supply chain. And I think to this ESG thing, call it whatever the hell you want, but that company was exposed by a reporter that said, like, look at what is happening in your supply chain. And they said, well, look, we hired a consultant that went and, did the thing to make sure that the supply chain was, compliant with whatever. Like, holy shit, man. There were people that were in terrible health conditions that were feeding this U.S. company that was then building lead acid batteries and whatever. To their credit, to that battery company's credit, once they figured all that out, they took a pivot. I mean, it is again, call it whatever you want. It is not what any U.S. company wants to do. And if they had, forgive me, but better ESG practices, they would not have found themselves in that situation in the first place. Again, to their credit, once they really uncovered what was going on, they pivoted. The other is actually a feed into the next story, which is governance. And that is like, if you don't have appropriate governance, if your board isn't looking under the hood, and this comes right back to like Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. So do you want to take us through, like, so when we kind of trying to structure this episode so it's, energy, national security, and now the startup economy. Builder AI is in a bad way. You want to cover that one?
Yeah, sure. So for those unfamiliar with the startup language, they talk about a unicorn being a company that's achieved $1 billion valuation. Apparently, in our high-powered startup economy, unicorn status is now even as big a deal as it used to be. Sometimes people talk about decacorns, which is some goofy ass word for a $10 billion company. But Builder AI, which was a no-code platform, had reached unicorn status as a $1.5 billion company and went from that to collapse PDQ. So yeah, AI-powered no-code platform with backing from Microsoft and then the Qatar Investment Authority. It filed for bankruptcy. It was associated with like the fact that it had inflated its 2024 revenue by 3x, which is like fraud. That's just fraud.
Holy
Um,
shit.
and it's referred to as a financial illusion in some of the word but let's just call a spade a spade. It's fraud. So creditors seized funds. Of course, it couldn't sustain operations when that was all discovered. It all collapsed. Multiple reports suggest that the AI powered app development was largely done by human engineers. Effectively, it was a mechanical Turk. And so it's just left a whole bunch of people in the lurch. Bad governance, bad procedures, bad oversight. Like, how the fuck does a board not know that like the books are being that cooked? Um, yeah. So it does. It reminds you a lot of Theranos, which is it's not as bad as Theranos, where like the thing never fucking worked, and she was like, sleeping with one of her co-founders and was and lying about it like the whole time, even lying about her own voice. But it's still pretty fucking bad. Like that degree of fraud. Like,
Oh, yeah. The segue here was about ESG though. I'm with you 100%. It's about risk mitigation. And I know there's been this big pushback against it, but if you think about the E, the S, and the G, I think it got lumped into like just broad environmentalism and the pushback that we would make decisions about a company based on, environmental and sustainable whatever. But I'm totally with you. It's just sort of the smart way of saying like, ooh, are we having, are we mitigating these risks that could come back and bite us? Whether it's, and it's not just ESG, it's more than that. But in this case in particular, if you had better governance, like also how are you pretending to have an AI capability and don't actually have it? Like, I don't know how on a product side that happens. This comes back to culture. Like, there's governance at multiple levels that builds a culture, and then how does that team not recognize that they're or not? So how does somebody not speak up and say like, hey, actually, you know what? We're building a $1 billion company on the back of something that doesn't actually exist.
I for me, it goes back to the idea of duty, right? Which is that like there were literally hundreds of people involved in that should have known better and should have done better. It comes back to me like my mind goes to the murders that are occurring, at the hands of the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean, right? And I'm not going to call them anything other than that. They're murders, right? And there's so many people that have like a sworn oath, and a legal duty to do better, and they're just rolling with it. Same thing happened here. Every one of those engineers, I was like, you got to fake until you make it in order to, to kind of just code it in the background. They were complicit. They were buying into that system. And, it's always easy to pass the responsibility up. But the people at the top rarely take responsibility either, right? Everybody has duty at every step from and if you know that what you're doing is fraudulent, you have a duty to say something. And like, you don't go immediately to necessarily the cops, or to legal authorities. They're probably not even going to believe you, unfortunately. But you do have a duty to escalate it. And then at a certain point, if you can't escalate it, you have a duty to quit. You have a duty to resign. You have a duty to do better. Um, and so the same thing happened to Theranos. The same thing happened. Like, so that's kind of the duty from the bottom up. But then there's like the governance structure from the top down, right? And the culture component of it. And like, I'm going to grind an axe here, which is like I get a little frustrated with like the venture capital community that talks about how they invest in incredible founders, and then they so often invest in scoundrels. Like Adam Newman, proven fraud. They paid him $1 billion to go away.
Yeah.
Raised $100 million into flow like earlier this year.
Hey, you will be happy to know, just this last week, I spent 4 hours with an investor, 3.5, and they just wanted to get to know me. It was really just like start from high school and I'd not actually ever had that before. It was very refreshing. And I will, anyway, there's one VC out there
There's more than one.
That
Like,
is
I'm friends with Tim. He does that the exact sort of thing. It's important part
okay.
for him is he goes and gets a
Yeah.
beer or a beverage if they're non-alcoholic, but like he goes and sits down with the founder and like gets to know him like really well. And
Mm,
to a certain extent, I don't want to, cast aspersions at the entire venture capital community. Some of this,
mm,
the structure of the system is kind of forces them into those behaviors to a certain extent. But like they also have a duty to kind of recognize like how they can do it better. And so the best ones do. That's Tim. That's
yeah.
the person that you were talking about earlier there. But that governance matters, man. Like the fastest way to
Mm,
blow up a company is to have, somebody cooking the books or a scandal or matter of fact, I would even venture to say that if Builder AI had been a $300 million company merely and was still working on the AI thing and was more transparent on the fact that like we still have to have engineers coding this sort of thing right now,
yeah, it probably would have been fine.
they would be in
Probably
business
would have
right
been fine.
now. They would be
Yeah.
mostly meeting the customer demands that they had sold because it's what they were doing, but they
Yeah.
lied about their revenue and they lied about like how they were serving the customer. And just
Mm,
fucking don't lie. There, there's millions of dollars to be made just by being an honest person. Like, do you have to have it
mm.
be even more by being a crook?
All right. So speaking of duty, we talked on the last episode about the "Don't Give Up the Ship," this video that Mark Kelly and other lawmakers made. There you go. Shout out to "Don't Give Up the Ship." Uh, and here's what I want to lead with this, which is, I'm pretty um, consistent. I watch Bill Maher's sort of Friday night real time, and what he's a pretty middle of the road guy. I mean, he's a lefty liberal, but I consider him to be pretty reasonable. What I found, and by the way, the video had just dropped when he said this, but I think what gave me some pause about this whole situation is that he didn't, as very well informed and smart guy, he didn't understand in the moment this very important word that said you do not have an obligation to follow illegal orders, like that illegal part, which is the key word in that whole video. He missed that too. His criticism of this is like, why do you got to make this video and encourage people to like encourage active duty to sort of not follow orders? And I think the reason I'm saying that and the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think we have our own bias as folks who lived this, breathed it, as military guys. This was not a shocking video, right? To say you do not have an obligation to follow illegal orders. Everyone in the military was like, yeah, of course. Like that's a yes. But the rest of the world heard it differently. And that's what I wanted to get your reaction to was, uh, I mean, certainly Trump saw it as a political opportunity, but I wonder how much of the rest of the world just heard you don't have to follow orders, not you don't have to follow illegal orders.
So I think there's a couple of things there. Sometimes things are put in public but really only have a specific audience. I think about that like with Christy Nome's book about how she talks about like shooting a dog and then getting mad and shooting a goat too because she's a fucking psychopath. And the audience was not the people that buy in the book. The audience was Donald Trump. She wanted to make sure that like he knew that if he got into his second administration, he could count on her to do whatever the fuck she was told. The same sort of thing I think applies here. It was put out in public, but the audience, I think, to me, was clear, which is it actually was the reason that they had the 6 people that signed up and spoke on this were all ex-national security or military is because they were people that had taken the same oath and they knew this, and that was who the audience was. And so, Bill Maher didn't get it at first. Like that's on Bill Maher. That's not that's they weren't talking to him to a certain extent. So I think about that a little bit. I also think that like Bill Maher has like a duty to think before he fucking reacts, right?
Yeah,
Like that's
I
part of
had the
being an
same
adult.
reaction. I really like him, but I was very disappointed in that moment for that reason. Yeah.
Like just sit and think about it for just a minute. It wouldn't take you that long
Hmm.
if you really said like I'm going to not fast react to this, but slow react.
Mm.
Smart enough guy. The context there. Don't know the context. You know the people to call. You're as connected as they come. So just stop and think for a second, and don't pick a team or react, or just think about the fucking thing for a second.
Mhm.
All you really need to know about it is the fact that Admiral Halsey, when he saw that they were doing murders in his name, he resigned apparently within 15 minutes.
I
There
didn't
are
know
times
that.
where you got to. I mean, had you heard about that?
No, I knew he had resigned, but I didn't know it was that fast.
Yeah. So for those unfamiliar, Admiral Halsey was the 4-star in charge of Southcom, which is the area of that includes the Caribbean and South America, like that the U.S. military is responsible for. And during the first strike, there was some reporting that came from the Washington Post here in the last couple of weeks about that apparently after the first strike against one of those boats, there was 2 survivors that were in the water, like clinging for their lives. Even in a totally legal and legitimate war, you are not supposed to kill those people. Like that is like it's a straight up fucking war crime. Send them to prison kind of thing.
Yeah, I've been telling people this analogy, which I think is apropos. It helps people understand is that when I was trained as a fighter pilot, if you shoot somebody down, you don't shoot the parachute of the pilot who ejected out of the other airplane.
That's right.
Or if they land in the water, you don't go strafe them and kill them. Once
Nope.
they are out of the airplane, they're no longer a threat to you. You let them float to the earth, and you go on about your day.
Yeah. And so there's so many ways in which this behavior is illegal, but this is the final and most evil act, right? Which is that people clinging for their lives in the water to a piece of flotsam, and you're going to kill them again. You're going to strike them again in order to make sure that they're dead. And so apparently Pete Hegg says something to the effect of like, kill them all, or kill them or shoot them again, to that effect. And apparently the reporting is that in the room it got very heated between Halsey and Hegseth. And then Halsey resigned about 15 minutes later. He says, I'm not going to be part of that. My only problem with Halsey is that he didn't speak up more publicly about this. This is the reason I resigned, because this person is doing something that is criminal. It's murder. And so that's my only problem with that behavior. But nonetheless, like he knew what he was doing. He had been entrusted into this position. He had the duty to do what he did, and he did it. Right. And so there's a lot of other people in the chain of command that had the duty not to do that too, and that went ahead and complied nonetheless. But Halsey didn't. Halsey did his duty. And so, you know, those are the kind of people that should have quicker actions. And they should be doing it from a place where they've thought about this before. They did the thinking before the thing happened. So that way, when it happened, they knew how to react. But if you're Bill Maher and you haven't done the thinking before it, stop. Do the thinking, man. Like that's all it takes. Use that
Mm.
front part of your brain instead of being, just a reactive little monkey like the rest of us.
All right. You ready for goods, bads, and others?
Yeah, man. Tell me what's going on good in your life.
Well, so I complained last time that I had this like longing to be outside. And sure enough, like the day after Thanksgiving, total surprise, my boys were like, "We want to go camping." I was like, "Really? What do you mean?" Anyway, they had it in their head. I don't know where it came from. I certainly didn't say it to them, but they came through and we went camping. So it was great. They had a blast. It was really cold overnight. It was like 32 degrees, and
Where'd you
we
guys
had an
go?
awesome time. Just east of Orange County, it's a place called Idlewild. There's a little
Mhm.
place. It's called Skunk Cabbage Meadow. It's a pretty cool place.
Don't know about
So
skunk
not far.
cabbage.
It's just like yeah. It was like 100. Like I'm sorry, an hour and a half or so walking, and then they wanted to go backpacking. They were very clear. We did not want to go car camping. I was like, cool, man. Like
They're after my
sweet.
own heart. Get on it, kids. Isn't skunk cabbage a nickname for marijuana?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe.
I think it is. Skunk
Maybe.
weed. Skunk
Okay.
weed.
Yeah.
Anyway, no.
Okay.
Obviously, lifelong for most of my career in the military, so not hip to the lingo.
I'm not hip to the lingo. My bad is that look, I mean, this is not a surprise. I just have to complain about it. There's another $679 million canceled for US wind projects. These, what's really bad about this is that these are projects that are underway. It's not just, some of these are not paper projects. There's a lot of paper projects too, but I just the moment of silence for the wind projects getting sort of crushed.
All of the above,
Um,
right? They're practicing the all of the above scenario, except for they're not.
except yeah. And then my other is like, look, you've seen you've seen bubbles burst. I've seen bubbles burst. It feels so much like we're about to see a bubble burst here. Tech stocks are down, crypto's down, people are getting nervous and wobbly. And so my other is just mm, I've been wrong about the market more than I've been right for sure. But this one for me is I'm watching it because it feels very much like we're about to burst.
A couple of numbers that I listen to Scott Galloway from time to time. A couple of numbers he throws out there is something like even before the kind of the AI run up, we were um, something like 70% of the world's market capitalization was in American stocks, right? Like that was like you could buy two times the rest of the world, or you could buy the U.S. once. Like that seems like maybe like there was just an imbalance between domestic and international equities. Um, and AI seems to have inflated that a little bit. So there's definitely a component. The other number that he talked about is that in order for valuations for AI to kind of prove out using traditional metrics, outside of meme stock sort of shit, is it would need to like cannibalize something like 1/6 or 1/8 of the American workforce, like a shockingly like double digits percentage of the American workforce, and like that may be valuable for the AI stocks, but it is destructive potentially for the rest of the economy. I think that's why we're starting to see some of these tech leaders that are talking about like universal basic income and stuff like that. And so I don't know. To your point, the last thing that he says is that your ability to withstand the market is shorter than its ability to remain irrational. So if you're trying to time it, you're probably going to lose.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah,
if there's something everybody's kind of talking about it. The vibes out there. You have, it's more than just kind of your traditional naysayers. There's a lot of people that are just like it's not all adding up anymore. So
yeah. I mean, and this is definitely like proximity bias, I guess you would call it, because also there've just been a lot of startup failures, and startup failures happen for a bunch of reasons. Right now, they're failing. A lot of them are failing because they can't get funding because the funding has and if that's true, that usually means that there's like a capital recycling problem. So I don't know. I mean, it's just as I say, I'm not. I just look at these factors that uh anyway, I want to hear about your guys' good bad notice. That one makes me nervous.
yeah, and I think that's a good one. It's something to keep your eye on. For me, the good is we're entering the holiday season. I enjoy this time of year. Obviously, going to miss my mother-in-law. My wife's having to deal with that a little bit, but generally, it's just a good time of year. It's busy, but there's a lot of parties and social events, and we're going to be hosting our own, and so like I'm just generally happy about it. Chance to just spend time with family and friends, and I really appreciate that. The bad of it is a lot of times this time of year I like to go skiing, and there's just not enough snow in Colorado. We finally had the first real snow in the last week. Um, I think, like 2 days ago, we got like our first like more than like half an inch sort of snow. And the half an inch only happened like a week prior to that too, right? So there's just not been enough here in Denver. And not that I want snow like at my house, but I definitely want it in the mountains. And it's hard to go skiing without snow, and there's just not any up there, and that's bad for not only my entertainment and it's bad for the country because Colorado's the headwater state. So much of our water supplies so much of America. And if we're not getting snow here, you're not getting water there, and that's a problem. So let's hope the season changes a little bit here. And then for me, my other is I'm watching to see what happens with this illegal orders component. I think the Senate has been negligent in its oversight of this for too long, but they're finally starting to show a little bit of backbone, mainly because it was just so egregious. I posted on social media the other day about like how Senator Tim Kaine, the Democrat from Virginia, was like, if true, this is a disturbing, and potentially illegal thing. I was like, no, no, no. This, again, like I said, this is the most recent, this is the last of a chain of illegal actions. Like, what have you been doing? To give a little bit of credit, though, one of the proponents that's been kind of overseeing on this is the Republican from Kentucky,
Yeah.
Rand Paul, and so I
Yeah.
want to give him some credit for that. He's got a little bit of a
Yeah.
libertarian bent and kind of,
Yeah.
so, but I'm glad to see both the Senate and the House starting to do some investigations. So many of these actors, though, have been so um, false for so long that I am reserving
Mm,
judgment. I don't. The die is not cast on this on what the outcome is going to be, whether they're actually going to hold him to account or whether they're going to have enough of a hearing to kind of justify that it looks like it from the public perception that they actually did something. Like no, like
right.
if they're actually doing something, Pete Hegseth needs to be impeached and then referred for criminal conviction. Like that's the what the law demands.
Mm,
Um, So, we'll see. I'm not going to accept, like, to me, it will not be that other will not convert into a good unless something very
mhm,
similar to that, that is the
mm,
outcome.
mm.
People need to swing for this.
I think the macro here is that Congress is not rolling over. That's the most to me. Yes, all of your. I'm I don't disagree with your other statements about this specific topic. What I like most is that Congress isn't just rolling over, which is they've been doing. It's so
Over and over and
disappointing.
over. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that they continue to build momentum here rather than just, shuttle it under.
Mm.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode of Hardpoints. Thanks for listening and for being part of the conversation around energy, national security, the startup world. If you found today's episode useful or thought provoking, as usual, please make sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and, of course, share us anywhere on social media you happen to exist. We'd love to be there too. Thanks again for joining us. Hardpoints is brought to you by the Valor Media Network. See you next time.